In the early 1500s, Italy was not a country. It was a battlefield, a chaotic quilt of city-states: Florence, Venice, Milan, the Papal States, each one maneuvering for dominance, each one vulnerable to foreign powers like France and Spain. Alliances were made and broken like promises in a storm. Armies marched, thrones were lost and stolen, and in the middle of all this turbulence stood a man who saw politics not as a dream, but as a blood-soaked reality. Niccolò Machiavelli wasn't a prince, nor a soldier, nor a king. He was a civil servant, a keen observer of power who had served the Florentine Republic until he was dismissed, tortured, and cast aside when the Medici family returned to power. But from the quiet of his exile, he wrote something that would shake the foundations of political thought: The Prince. Unlike the lofty, idealistic writings of his predecessors, who urged rulers to be just, noble, and guided by divine virtue, Machiavelli offered something altogether different: a mirror. Not to what leaders should be, but to what they were. Ruthless, cunning, and obsessed with survival. In The Prince, virtue was no longer about goodness. It was about effectiveness. A ruler's morality was measured not by their intentions, but by their outcomes. Was their state secure? Were their enemies subdued? Did they stay in power? That was the new standard. This wasn't cynicism for its own sake. It was clarity born of chaos. And in choosing to write the truth of power, unvarnished, uncomfortable, and brutally honest, Machiavelli did something radical. He redefined what it meant to lead. And that redefinition? It didn't stay in Renaissance Italy. It echoed through time, into empires, into parliaments, into boardrooms. Even now, in the back rooms of global strategy and the front-facing performances of modern leadership, the Prince lives on. Because Machiavelli didn't just write about power, he changed the game. To understand The Prince, you have to understand the chaos that gave birth to it. Renaissance Italy was a masterpiece in crisis. Yes, it was the cradle of art, science, and rediscovered classical wisdom, but politically, it was fractured and bleeding. Unlike the emerging nation-states of France and Spain, Italy was a patchwork of city-states, each one proud, each one paranoid, and each one vulnerable. Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, the Papal States. They fought with each other as often as they fended off foreign invaders. And invaders came. In 1494, the French stormed into Italy under Charles VIII, kicking off a series of brutal wars that would drag on for decades. The Spanish joined the fray. The Holy Roman Empire took its turn. And all the while, the papacy, ostensibly the moral center of Christendom, was playing its own dark game of politics, more interested in earthly power than heavenly grace. Florence, Machiavelli's home, was no exception to this unrest. The powerful Medici family had ruled for years before being expelled, replaced by a short-lived republic. And during that fragile window, Machiavelli rose through the ranks of Florentine politics. He served as a diplomat, a secretary, a negotiator, sent on delicate missions to courts across Europe. He met popes and princes, kings and mercenaries. He watched alliances bloom and collapse. He saw firsthand the cunning, the betrayal, and the sheer volatility that defined leadership in his time. So when the Medici returned and Machiavelli was imprisoned, tortured, and exiled, he didn't write a book of dreams. He wrote a manual for survival. The Prince was born not from theory, but from scars. It was a reckoning, a call to face the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. And in doing so, Machiavelli offered something rare and unsettling: a politics stripped of illusions. Because when the world burns around you, idealism is a luxury. Realism becomes a necessity. When we hear the word virtue, we often think of goodness, of honesty, humility, compassion. But Machiavelli had a different kind of virtue in mind. His word was virtù, and it had very little to do with being good. For Machiavelli, virtù meant strength, willpower, intelligence, the ability to seize the moment, to bend circumstances to your will, to adapt with grace, or strike with precision. It was boldness mixed with strategy, not moral excellence, but mastery of one's environment. And yet, even the most capable leader, he argued, could not rely solely on virtù. There was another force always at play: Fortuna, fortune, luck, fate, the unpredictable currents of the world that no amount of planning can fully tame. War, weather, betrayal, death. Fortuna is the chaos that crashes through human intention. But here's where Machiavelli was radical. He didn't advise surrendering to fortune. He encouraged confrontation. He famously compared fortune to a woman, saying that, like any wild force, she favors those who are bold, even forceful. His advice to rulers? Don't wait for luck to favor you. Seize it, shape it, wrestle it into submission if you must. In other words, fortune favors the prepared and the daring. This philosophy marked a sharp departure from the ideals of classical and Christian thinkers before him. Plato's philosopher king was wise, rational, and just, a lover of truth who governed with harmony in mind. Augustine's vision of leadership, shaped by Christian humility, asked rulers to serve with virtue, guided by divine will and moral restraint. But Machiavelli had seen too many good men fail and too many bad ones thrive. He wasn't interested in ideals that didn't hold up in the mud and blood of real politics. To him, a successful leader didn't just possess virtù. He had to know how to read Fortuna and, when necessary, defy her. Because in a world where chaos is constant, power belongs not to the pure, but to the prepared. And it was this balancing act, between control and chaos, will and chance, that Machiavelli believed defined the fate of every ruler. If there's one idea that made the prince both legendary and reviled, it's this: that in politics, morality is optional. Machiavelli didn't just suggest that rulers might have to act unethically to preserve their power. He insisted they must be ready to do so. He famously wrote, "A prince must learn how not to be good." And with that, centuries of idealistic political philosophy were suddenly on trial. For Machiavelli, the ruler's duty wasn't to be virtuous. It was to be effective, to maintain order, to protect the state. If lies achieved that goal, so be it. If cruelty prevented greater chaos, it was justified. It is much safer to be feared than loved, he warned, if one must choose. Not because he enjoyed tyranny, but because he understood human nature. Love, he argued, is fragile. It fades, it wavers. But fear? Fear endures. It protects the throne. This wasn't just a cold calculation. It was a fundamental reframing of political purpose. Up to that point, most political theory had been deeply entwined with morality. Plato spoke of the just ruler. Aristotle tied ethics to citizenship. Augustine believed good governance must reflect divine order. Rulers were supposed to be noble shepherds, leading their people with wisdom and compassion. But Machiavelli stripped away that illusion. He separated ethics from effectiveness. And that separation was scandalous. To many, the prince read like a guidebook for tyranny, its author a cynical apostle of power at any cost. But here's the subtle truth. Machiavelli wasn't advocating evil for its own sake. He wasn't delighting in cruelty. He was asking a hard question, one that still haunts us. What if good intentions aren't enough? What if being kind gets you killed and your people suffer for it? The prince made clear that the world of politics operates by different rules, that a leader's private morality may need to be sacrificed for public survival. And in doing so, it didn't just influence politics, it unsettled it. It forced rulers, philosophers, and citizens alike to confront the dark compromise at the heart of power. Because when peace and stability are on the line, Machiavelli asks, is it better to be good or to win? What makes The Prince so haunting isn't just what it said about Renaissance Italy. It's what it continues to reveal about us, 5 centuries later. Machiavelli's world was one of shifting loyalties, fragile alliances, and ruthless ambition. Sound familiar? The faces have changed, the costumes have changed, but the game of power remains startlingly recognizable. Across history, you'll find leaders who read The Prince not as a warning, but as a guide. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, orchestrated unification through war, deception, and backroom deals, embodying virtù with surgical precision. Richard Nixon, in the United States, mastered image and secrecy, rising to power through sheer political calculation, only to fall when his paranoia overtook his strategy. Vladimir Putin today commands through a blend of controlled fear, state narrative, and cold pragmatism, more a modern Medici than a democratic idealist. But it's not just statesmen who borrow from Machiavelli's playbook. In the boardrooms of multinational corporations, you'll find CEOs who cultivate charm on stage while consolidating power behind closed doors. Consider the way Steve Jobs controlled Apple, not only as a visionary, but as a meticulous orchestrator of perception and product dominance. Or how Elon Musk shifts public attention, manipulates markets, and disrupts norms, often by mastering the art of unpredictability, another tool straight from The Prince. Even in Hollywood, the echoes are there. PR machines, image management, strategic relationships, entertainers and agents alike maneuver through a world where power is perception, and survival depends on controlling the story. Machiavelli understood something timeless. Leadership isn't just about ruling. It's about navigating people, their hopes, fears, and illusions. It's about knowing when to speak softly and when to strike. And above all, it's about knowing the cost of naivety in a world that rarely rewards innocence. That's why The Prince endures, not just as a relic of political history, but as a mirror. A dark, uncomfortable mirror. One that reflects back our ambitions, our compromises, and our hidden desires for control. Because whether you're sitting on a throne, running a company, or building a brand, Machiavelli's question still lingers. Do you want to look good, or do you want to win? Say the word Machiavellian, and what comes to mind? Scheming, manipulative, cold-blooded. It's become shorthand for ruthless ambition, the kind that stabs in the back and smiles while doing it. Over the centuries, Machiavelli has been cast as the devil's advisor, the dark whisper behind the throne. But the truth is far more nuanced and far more human. Machiavelli wasn't a monster. He wasn't advocating tyranny for tyranny's sake. He didn't wake up one day and decide to destroy virtue. He was, above all, a patriot. A man who watched his beloved Florence fall into chaos. A man who saw Italy fractured, weakened, and exploited by foreign powers. And The Prince? It wasn't a villain's manifesto. It was a survival manual, a wake-up call to leaders who, in his view, were too idealistic to hold their ground in a brutal world. He wasn't telling rulers to be evil. He was urging them to be awake, to see people not as they should be, but as they are. To make decisions based on reality, not fantasy. And if that meant getting their hands dirty to preserve stability, so be it. What drove him wasn't cynicism, it was urgency. He wanted a strong, unified Italy. He wanted leadership that could outmaneuver foreign invaders and internal betrayal. He wanted a future that didn't collapse under the weight of idealism. So no, Machiavelli wasn't teaching cruelty. He was exposing fragility. He wasn't celebrating deceit. He was warning that in politics, naivety is often fatal. And perhaps the greatest irony is this. In trying to tell the hard truth, Machiavelli became a symbol of the very darkness he hoped leaders could resist, if only they had the strength to face the world as it truly is. To truly understand Machiavelli, you have to read beyond The Prince. There's another side to him, one that reveals just how complex and perhaps misunderstood he really was. That other side lives in Discourses on Livy, his second major work, and one that often surprises readers who only know him by reputation. Unlike The Prince, which focuses on the actions of singular rulers, the Discourses is a celebration of republics, of shared power, citizen participation, and the long-term health of a political system. It draws heavily on Roman history, praising the Roman Republic for its institutions, its checks and balances, and the civic virtue of its people. Machiavelli admired the energy that comes from public debate, the innovation that arises in a society where power is distributed rather than hoarded. So, how do we reconcile the two? The ruthless, pragmatic tone of The Prince with the hopeful, participatory spirit of the Discourses? The answer lies in context. The Prince was a response to crisis, a desperate time calling for urgent remedies. Florence was unstable. Italy was divided. The work is situational, tactical. The Discourses, on the other hand, is philosophical. It speaks to the possibility of building something lasting, not just surviving, but thriving. This tension isn't a contradiction. It's a reflection of Machiavelli's depth. He wasn't dogmatic. He was adaptable. He understood that different times demand different strategies. And maybe that's the most Machiavellian insight of all, that wisdom lies not in rigid ideology, but in knowing which truths to apply, and when. From the halls of Renaissance Italy to the screens of Netflix, The Prince has never stopped echoing through our understanding of power. Its influence shaped the minds of Enlightenment thinkers like Hobbes and Rousseau, men who wrestled with the tension between authority and liberty, control and chaos. It traveled through the corridors of revolution and empire, informing political strategy in both democratic and autocratic regimes. Wherever power is contested, The Prince is often within arm's reach. And today, you don't have to be a scholar to feel Machiavelli's presence. Just watch House of Cards, where manipulation is an art form, or Game of Thrones, where alliances crumble, loyalty shifts, and rulers must choose between honor and survival. The fingerprints of The Prince are everywhere. In political thrillers, corporate dramas, and dark anti-hero sagas that explore what people are willing to do to win. Why does it endure? Because Machiavelli understood something unchanging, that beneath the surface of ideology, ambition pulses, that people, especially those who lead, are driven by fear, desire, and the hunger to maintain control. The Prince doesn't just describe politics, it describes people. And as long as human nature remains complex, conflicted, and ambitious, Machiavelli will never go out of style. Machiavelli didn't invent the darkness in politics. He revealed it. The Prince isn't a blueprint for cruelty. It's a mirror, one that reflects the compromises, the calculations, and the quiet brutality that often hide behind polished speeches and smiling faces. It forces us to ask, is our leadership driven by principle or performance? Centuries later, in a world that still prizes results over integrity, headlines over honesty, are we simply reading Machiavelli, or are we living him? That's the uncomfortable brilliance of his work. It doesn't tell us what to think. It dares us to look closer, to understand the machinery of power without flinching. And in doing so, it offers not just strategy, but clarity. So perhaps the goal isn't to become Machiavellian. It's to understand him deeply enough that we can choose differently.